At 0900 hours on February 19, 1945, Corporal Tony Stein crouched behind a shallow depression in the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima, gripping a weapon his commanding officer had called a goddamn death trap 3 months earlier. The beach around him was a killing ground, where 23-year-old Marines were dying faster than corpsmen could drag them to cover, their blood mixing with volcanic ash that refused to absorb it. Stein was among the first men from Company A, 1st Battalion, 28th Marines, to push beyond the terrace line where Japanese machine gun fire had pinned down 3 entire platoons in the first 40 minutes of combat. The weapon in his hands weighed 25 pounds, fed from a 100-round ammunition box, and could fire 200 rounds per minute, 3 times faster than any standard Marine Corps infantry weapon. The Japanese had spent 8 months fortifying every meter of this 8-square-mile rock with 11 miles of interconnected tunnels, 17,000 defenders positioned in mutually supporting positions, and overlapping fields of fire designed specifically to turn the landing beaches into mass graves. By mid-morning, the 5th Marine Division had already lost 43 men killed and 127 wounded, most of them cut down before they could even identify where the enemy fire was coming from. The standard-issue Browning M1919 machine guns were effective at suppressing enemy positions, but they weighed 31 pounds empty and required 2-man crews to operate. Good for defensive positions, terrible for assault. Stein had known about this problem for months. Back in November 1944, at Camp Tarawa in Hawaii, he had watched machine gun crews struggle during company-level training exercises where rifle platoons would advance on mock enemy positions. The gunners would set up their M1919s, fire suppressive bursts, then spend precious minutes breaking down the weapon and moving forward while the riflemen waited. By the time the gun was operational again, the momentum was gone. Stein, who had spent his teenage years working a lathe at Patterson Field, and then as a tool and die maker at Delco Products in Dayton, Ohio, understood machines the way some men understood people. He could look at a mechanical system and see not just what it was designed to do, but what it could do if you changed 3 or 4 critical components. When Sergeant Mel Grevich approached him in that maintenance shed back in Hawaii with a salvaged ANM-2 aircraft machine gun, Stein saw the solution immediately. The ANM-2 was designed for aerial combat, mounted in the wings or rear cockpits of Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, where gunners engaged Japanese Zeros at 250 miles per hour. It weighed only 21 pounds, 10 pounds lighter than the M1919, and its rate of fire was staggering, 200 to 500 rounds per minute compared to the M1919's 400-500. But there was a fundamental problem that had prevented anyone else from trying what Grevich was proposing. The ANM-2 had spade grips designed for aircraft mounts, no buttstock for shoulder firing, no iron sights for aiming, and no way for a single Marine to carry it while advancing and fire accurately at ground targets. Grevich had salvaged the weapon from a crashed SBD during the Bougainville campaign in 1943. He had carried it through 2 island operations, convinced that someone, somewhere, could make it work as an infantry weapon. When both men were reassigned to the newly formed 28th Marines in November 1944, Grevich knew they were training for an operation that would make Tarawa look like a training exercise. He needed that gun working before they shipped out. They worked at night in a maintenance shed on the perimeter of Camp Tarawa, using tools Stein had either borrowed or fabricated himself. First, he cut down an M1 Garand buttstock, hollowing it out with a wood rasp to accept the machine gun's buffer tube assembly. The fit had to be precise. Too loose, and the weapon would tear itself apart from recoil. Too tight, and the buffer system wouldn't cycle properly. He spent 4 nights getting the dimensions right, testing the fit with measuring calipers he'd borrowed from the motor pool. Next came the trigger mechanism. The ANM-2's original firing system was designed to be activated by a Bowden cable connected to the pilot's controls. Stein fabricated a solenoid-style trigger from sheet metal scraps and spring steel, creating a butterfly-style trigger that could be operated with one hand while the other steadied the weapon. Grevich, who had worked as a welder before the war, attached a Browning automatic rifle bipod to the front of the gun's barrel shroud. The bipod was critical. Without it, the weapon would be impossible to aim during sustained fire. They added bar rear sights, calibrating them for distances between 50 and 300 yards. The result was crude, unbalanced, and looked like it had been assembled from spare parts in someone's garage, which it had. The weapon weighed 25 pounds loaded, fired from a 100-round linked ammunition box that hung below the receiver, and could empty that entire box in 5 seconds of continuous fire. When Stein demonstrated it on the range for the first time, firing a sustained burst into a target 200 yards downrange, the recoil vibration was so violent that it fractured 2 bones in his right wrist. He bound the wrist with medical tape, adjusted his grip, and fired again. This time the burst was controlled, accurate, devastating. The target, a wooden frame covered with canvas, disintegrated. 3 company commanders watched the demonstration. One of them, Captain Thomas, said, "That's the stupidest goddamn thing I've ever seen work." Another officer, Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson, watched Stein fire a second magazine and said, "Build 5 more." Stein built 6 Stingers total, 1 for each of Company A's 3 rifle platoons, 1 for the demolition section, 1 for Grevich, and 1 for himself. The reaction from other Marines ranged from enthusiastic to openly hostile. Some saw the weapon as brilliant improvisation. Others called it a death trap that would jam on the first burst or melt its barrel after 2 magazines. A platoon commander from 2nd Battalion looked at the improvised gun and told Stein that only an idiot would carry a plain gun into an infantry fight. But when Company A shipped out from Hawaii in January 1945, all 6 Stingers were packed in wooden crates marked non-standard equipment. Now, on the black sand beach at Iwo Jima, Stein tightened his grip on the weapon. The Stinger's barrel was already warm from a 30-second burst he'd fired at a suspected enemy position 90 yards to his left. Around him, Marines were dying because they couldn't locate the hidden Japanese positions fast enough. Standard Marine Corps procedure was to call for M4 Sherman tanks or naval gunfire to suppress fortified positions, but the tanks were bogged down in the volcanic ash that swallowed their treads, and naval shells couldn't hit targets they couldn't see. Stein made a decision that would define the next 8 hours of his life. He stood up, fully upright in the middle of a beach where Japanese machine gunners had zeroed in overlapping fields of fire during weeks of preparation. Corporal Tony Stein, 23 years old, 6 combat missions, tool and die maker from Dayton, Ohio, exposed himself deliberately to draw enemy attention. He needed them to reveal their positions. He needed to see the muzzle flashes. Bullets snapped past his head, with the distinctive crack of rounds breaking the sound barrier within 2 feet of a human body. Mortar rounds detonated in the ash 15 yards to his right, throwing shrapnel that tore through the air with a sound like fabric ripping. And then Stein saw it. A pillbox, 75 yards northwest, camouflaged with volcanic rock and sand so effectively that it had been invisible until the Type 92 heavy machine gun inside opened fire. The barrel protruded just inches from the firing slit. Stein lowered the Stinger, aligned the bar sights on the position, and squeezed the solenoid trigger. The weapon roared to life at 1,200 rounds per minute, 20 rounds per second, hammering into volcanic rock and sandbags with impacts that sounded like a pneumatic drill hitting concrete. The pillbox position disintegrated under the sustained burst. Dust, rock fragments, and metal splinters exploded from the structure. The Type 92 fell silent after 4 seconds. Through the dust and smoke, Stein shifted his aim to a second pillbox, 40 yards left of the first position. Another burst, 5 seconds of continuous fire, 100 rounds from the ammunition box. The concrete structure absorbed some of the impacts, but the volume of fire was overwhelming. The Japanese machine gun crew inside stopped shooting. Around Stein, Marines began to move. Seeing the enemy positions suppressed, riflemen advanced from their shallow depressions in the sand where they'd been pinned for 30 minutes. Sergeants shouted orders. The assault was moving again. Stein charged the first pillbox. The Stinger was lighter than the M1919, and he could run with it in a way machine gunners couldn't with standard weapons. He covered 75 yards in 18 seconds, his boots sinking 3 inches into volcanic ash with each stride. Inside the pillbox, 3 Japanese soldiers lay dead, their bodies torn apart by 30 caliber rounds that had punched through sandbags and concrete alike. He moved to the second pillbox. Same result. 2 enemy soldiers dead, the position destroyed. But then Stein felt the Stinger go light in his hands. The ammunition box was empty. 100 rounds consumed in less than 10 seconds of actual trigger time across 2 bursts. He had anticipated this problem during training in Hawaii, but experiencing it in combat was different. The weapon was devastating and impossibly hungry. Stein looked back toward the beach, 200 yards behind him, where the ammunition resupply point was located near the waterline. Landing craft were still unloading supplies under sporadic mortar fire. He would have to cross open ground, fully exposed, to get more linked 30 caliber ammunition. He started running. The volcanic sand made every step exhausting. It wasn't like normal beach sand that packed firm underfoot. This ash was loose, terraced, gave way with every stride. Marines called it running through ball bearings. Stein's boots sank 3 inches with each step, and the 25-pound Stinger felt like it gained weight with every yard. Halfway to the beach, he passed a wounded Marine, Private First Class from 2nd Platoon, with shrapnel wounds to his left leg and abdomen. The man was conscious, but couldn't walk. Blood soaked through his dungarees. Stein didn't hesitate. He grabbed the wounded Marine, slung him over his shoulder in a fireman's carry, and kept running toward the beach. The Marine weighed 160 pounds. The Stinger weighed 25. Stein's combat pack added another 30. He was carrying 215 pounds across 100 yards of volcanic ash, while Japanese snipers fired at anything that moved. He reached the ammunition point at 09:47 hours, dropped the wounded Marine next to a Navy corpsman, grabbed 4 100-round ammunition boxes, 40 pounds of linked 30 caliber rounds, and turned around to run back. This was the moment Stein realized something that would change the next 8 hours of his life. His boots were slowing him down. The volcanic ash filled them, added weight, reduced his speed. Without thinking about it, without asking permission, he kicked off both boots and started running barefoot back toward the front line. The volcanic ash was warm, not hot enough to burn, but warm from the sun and from the underground steam vents that made Iwo Jima smell like sulfur. His feet sank into the loose material, but now he could feel the terrain, adjust his stride, move faster. He covered the 200 yards back to Company A's position in less than 2 minutes, dropped 3 ammunition boxes with Sergeant Grevich, kept the 4th for himself, and loaded the Stinger. At 1003 hours, Japanese Type 89 grenade dischargers, what Marines called knee mortars, began dropping rounds on Company A's position with devastating accuracy. Stein spotted the crew 110 yards northeast, partially concealed behind a destroyed American landing craft. He fired a 6-second burst, 120 rounds, that killed 2 of the 3 crew members and destroyed the mortar. At 10:27 hours, he made his second run to the beach, this time carrying a wounded lieutenant who had taken shrapnel to both legs. At 1104 hours, his third run. At 11:47 hours, his 4th. By noon, Stein had made 5 trips to the ammunition resupply point, evacuated 4 wounded Marines, and personally destroyed 7 Japanese positions. His feet were bleeding. Volcanic ash contained tiny fragments of sharp obsidian that cut into bare skin like glass. But he refused to put his boots back on because the speed advantage was too valuable. At 12:23 hours, he spotted a Japanese soldier attempting to throw a Type 97 hand grenade at a squad of Marines advancing on the right flank. Stein fired a 2-second burst, 40 rounds, that killed the grenade thrower and 2 other enemy soldiers positioned in a spider hole. At 13:15 hours, a Japanese sniper's bullet grazed Stein's left shoulder, tearing through his dungaree jacket and removing a strip of skin 4 inches long. The wound bled heavily, but hadn't hit bone or major blood vessels. A Navy corpsman tried to evacuate him to the beach aid station. Stein refused. He loaded a fresh ammunition box into the Stinger and moved forward with 3rd Platoon toward a fortified position on the ridge line 300 yards inland. At 14:02 hours, during the assault on that position, the Stinger jammed. A ruptured cartridge case had lodged in the chamber, and the extractor claw had torn through the brass rim without pulling the case free. Stein field stripped the weapon under fire, a process that normally took 3 minutes, and cleared the jam in 45 seconds using a cleaning rod from his pack. He reassembled the gun, loaded a fresh ammunition box, and resumed firing. The Japanese position fell at 14:34 hours after Stein's sustained fire killed 3 defenders and forced the others to abandon their weapons. By 1600 hours, Tony Stein had personally killed 20 Japanese soldiers, destroyed or suppressed 11 defensive positions, made 8 trips to the ammunition resupply point, covering a cumulative distance of 1,600 yards across open ground, and evacuated 9 wounded Marines who would have died on that beach. The Stinger had fired approximately 2,600 rounds, 26 ammunition boxes. The barrel was so hot that when rain started falling at 15:47 hours, water droplets hitting the metal produced steam with an audible hiss. Stein's feet looked like ground meat, shredded by volcanic ash and obsidian fragments. His left shoulder wound had reopened twice. His hands were blistered from gripping the overheated weapon. At 16:47 hours, Lieutenant Colonel Johnson ordered Stein to evacuate to the beach aid station for treatment. Stein complied this time because his hands were shaking too badly from exhaustion to aim accurately. Navy corpsmen treated his wounds, gave him water, told him he was being evacuated to a hospital ship offshore. Stein nodded, drank the water, and when the corpsman turned to treat other casualties, he walked back toward Company A's position. He was intercepted by a military police sergeant, who informed him that evacuated personnel were not permitted to return to combat positions without authorization. Stein explained, calmly and with perfect logic, that he hadn't been officially evacuated. He'd simply received medical treatment at the aid station. The MP sergeant, who had watched Marines die all day, looked at Stein's bloody feet and torn shoulder, and decided not to argue with someone carrying a 25-pound machine gun built from salvaged aircraft parts. Stein returned to his unit at 18:03 hours. By then, the Stinger's barrel had cooled enough to function reliably. He fought until darkness made further advances impossible. At 19:47 hours, Company A established a defensive perimeter 400 yards inland from the beach. They had advanced farther than any other unit in the 5th Marine Division. Stein sat in a foxhole, his bare feet wrapped in bandages, the Stinger beside him, and realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten. But the day wasn't over yet. At 21:34 hours, Japanese infiltrators attempted to penetrate Company A's perimeter, a tactic they used throughout the Battle of Iwo Jima to create chaos in American positions during darkness. Stein heard movement 30 yards from his position. He couldn't see clearly in the darkness, but he could hear the distinctive sound of Japanese Type 96 light machine gun being moved into position. He aimed the Stinger by sound, fired a 3-second burst, and heard screaming. The infiltration attempt failed. Tony Stein survived the first day of Iwo Jima. The Stinger had performed exactly as he'd designed it to, devastating firepower in a package light enough for one man to carry and aggressive enough to change the tactical equation on a beach where Marines were dying because they couldn't suppress enemy positions fast enough. But Iwo Jima would last 36 more days, and Stein's war was far from The sun rose over Iwo Jima on February 20th, 1945, at 0641 hours, revealing a beach covered with destroyed landing craft, abandoned equipment, and the bodies of 137 Marines who hadn't survived the first day. Tony Stein's feet had swollen during the night. The corpsman who examined them at 0530 hours said both feet showed signs of infection from volcanic ash embedded in dozens of cuts. The corpsman recommended immediate evacuation to a hospital ship. Stein refused medical evacuation for the second time in 12 hours, instead requesting fresh bandages and antibiotics. He pulled on his boots despite the pain, because Company A was advancing inland at 0700 hours, and he knew the volcanic terrain ahead would be worse than the beach. The Stinger had survived the first day with only minor damage. The barrel showed heat-stress discoloration, blue-purple oxidation patterns that indicated it had been fired well beyond manufacturer specifications. Stein inspected the weapon thoroughly, checking the buffer spring tension, examining the extractor claw for wear, testing the trigger mechanism. Everything functioned. He loaded a fresh 100-round ammunition box and reported to Lieutenant Colonel Johnson at 0645 hours. Johnson looked at Stein's bandaged feet and said, "I'm ordering you to stay with the aid station today." Stein nodded, said, "Yes, sir," and 30 minutes later was advancing with 3rd Platoon toward the ridgeline 700 yards inland. The terrain changed dramatically once Company A pushed beyond the beach terraces. The volcanic rock formations created natural defensive positions every 50 yards, jagged outcroppings, collapsed lava tubes, and depression that Japanese defenders had reinforced with sandbags and logs. American tactics called for combined infantry tank assaults against these positions, but the Sherman tanks couldn't navigate the broken terrain. Infantry units were advancing alone, taking casualties from positions they couldn't suppress with rifle fire. At 0847 hours, 3rd Platoon encountered a fortified machine gun nest positioned in a collapsed lava tube 140 yards ahead. The Japanese crew had fields of fire covering 3 separate approach routes. 2 Marines were killed in the first 30 seconds when they attempted to advance on the right flank. Stein moved forward alone, carrying the Stinger. He used the volcanic rock formations for cover, advancing in short rushes of 10-15 yards, then dropping behind cover before the Japanese gunners could adjust their aim. At 90 yards from the target, he found a position with adequate cover and clear line of sight to the enemy emplacement. He set up the bipod, aligned the bar sights, and fired a sustained burst. 8 seconds, 160 rounds. The volume of fire was so intense that the Japanese position simply disappeared in a cloud of dust, pulverized rock, and metal fragments. The Type 92 machine gun fell silent. 3 enemy soldiers were dead. 3rd Platoon advanced. At 0934 hours, Stein destroyed his second position of the day, a sniper nest in volcanic rocks, 180 yards northeast. The sniper had killed 2 Marines and wounded a Navy corpsman. Stein fired a 4-second burst that collapsed the rock formation the sniper was using for cover. At 10:23 hours, he suppressed a Japanese grenade discharger crew that was dropping rounds on 2nd Platoon from a ridgeline 220 yards distant. The sustained fire didn't kill the crew, but it forced them to abandon their position and retreat deeper into the tunnel system. The pattern repeated throughout the morning. Japanese defenders would engage American units from fortified positions. Marines would call for tank support that couldn't navigate the terrain, and Stein would advance with the Stinger to suppress the position with overwhelming firepower. By 1200 hours, he had personally destroyed or suppressed 6 enemy positions and made 3 trips back to the ammunition resupply point to restock the linked 30 caliber rounds. Each trip covered approximately 300 yards across broken volcanic terrain. He was still barefoot. The boots hurt too much to wear, and his feet were leaving bloody footprints on the black volcanic rock. At 1247 hours, something changed in the Japanese defensive tactics. American intelligence had reported that Japanese commanders were adapting their strategy, focusing less on beach defense and more on creating a defensive zone in the interior highlands, where American artillery and naval gunfire would be less effective. Company A encountered the first evidence of this new strategy when they approached a ridgeline designated Hill 165 on Marine Corps maps, a volcanic formation 165 feet above sea level that dominated the surrounding terrain for 600 yards in every direction. The Japanese had fortified Hill 165 with interlocking defensive positions, underground bunkers connected by tunnels, and pre-registered mortar fire zones that covered every approach route. At 13:02 hours, Company A began their assault on the hill. Within 10 minutes, they had taken 11 casualties without advancing more than 40 yards. The Japanese defenders were using a tactic that would become standard throughout the Battle of Iwo Jima. They would allow American forces to advance into pre-registered killing zones, then open fire from multiple positions simultaneously. Marine rifle fire couldn't suppress positions they couldn't see. Stein moved forward with 3rd Platoon. At 13:34 hours, a Japanese Type 97 hand grenade landed 8 feet from his position. He threw himself sideways into a depression in the volcanic rock as the grenade detonated, showering him with shrapnel and rock fragments. 2 pieces of shrapnel penetrated his right thigh, small fragments that caused bleeding, but didn't hit the femoral artery. A corpsman applied field dressings, while Stein reloaded the stinger. The corpsman said, "You need to evacuate." Stein said, "I need more ammunition boxes." At 1411 hours, he identified 3 Japanese defensive positions on Hill 165 that were preventing 3rd Platoon from advancing. The positions were spaced 60 yards apart, mutually supporting, dug into volcanic rock with reinforced overhead cover. Standard Marine Corps tactics called for artillery fire to reduce fortified positions before infantry assault, but the forward observer couldn't get accurate coordinates because the Japanese positions were so well camouflaged. Stein decided to suppress all 3 positions simultaneously using a tactic he'd never attempted before: sustained sweeping fire. He positioned himself 110 yards from the nearest Japanese emplacement, set up the Stinger's bipod on flat volcanic rock, and loaded a fresh 100-round ammunition box. Then he opened fire and didn't stop. He swept the barrel from left to right, hosing all 3 positions with continuous fire, 200 rounds per minute, creating a sustained wall of 30 caliber rounds that hammered volcanic rock, sandbags, logs, and human flesh without discrimination. The first ammunition box emptied in 5 seconds. He loaded another and continued firing. The second box emptied. He loaded a third. The barrel began to glow cherry red, visible even in daylight. The tactic worked. The volume of fire was so overwhelming that the Japanese defenders couldn't return fire accurately. 3rd Platoon advanced during this suppressive fire, reaching the first enemy position before the defenders could recover. At 14:29 hours, Hill 165 fell to Company A. Stein had personally fired 400 rounds in less than 30 seconds, destroyed 2 of the 3 defensive positions, and killed an estimated 8 Japanese soldiers. The Stinger's barrel was so hot that it had started to droop slightly from heat stress. The metal was approaching its failure temperature. Stein field stripped the weapon, let it cool for 15 minutes, then reassembled it and continued the advance. But the Japanese weren't finished adapting. At 15:02 hours, American intelligence intercepted a Japanese radio transmission indicating that enemy commanders had identified a Marine carrying an automatic weapon with exceptionally high rate of fire. The transmission ordered Japanese snipers and grenade discharger crews to prioritize this target. Tony Stein had become such an effective threat that the Japanese were actively hunting him. He didn't know this at the time. The intelligence report wouldn't reach Company A for another 3 hours, but he noticed that Japanese fire seemed to focus on his position more than on other Marines. At 15:34 hours, a Japanese sniper's bullet struck the Stinger's receiver, penetrating the thin metal housing and damaging the buffer spring assembly. The weapon jammed. Stein examined the damage and realized the buffer spring was bent, preventing the bolt from cycling properly. This wasn't a field repairable failure. The weapon was effectively destroyed. He had two choices: abandon the Stinger and fight with his M1 Garand rifle, or return to the beach and attempt to repair the weapon using tools from the armorer's shed. He chose the latter because he knew Company A would need the Stinger's firepower for the next day's advance. He walked back to the beach, still barefoot, still bleeding from his thigh wounds, carrying a 25-pound machine gun that no longer functioned. At 16:18 hours, he reached the armorer's shed, where Sergeant Grevich was working on weapons maintenance. They examined the damaged buffer spring together. Grevich said the spring was beyond repair, but he had salvaged springs from two other destroyed AN-M2 aircraft guns from wrecked aircraft. They spent 90 minutes fabricating a replacement spring, testing the tension, installing it in the Stinger, and test-firing the weapon to confirm it functioned properly. At 17:51 hours, Stein walked back to Company A's forward position with a fully operational Stinger. February 21st through March 3rd, 1945, followed similar patterns. Company A advanced slowly across Iwo Jima's volcanic terrain, taking casualties from hidden Japanese positions, calling for the Stinger when rifle fire couldn't suppress enemy emplacements. Stein made an average of 4 trips per day to the ammunition resupply point. His feet never fully healed, new cuts opened every day, and the infection worsened despite antibiotics. By February 25th, he could barely walk without intense pain. By March 1st, he was limping noticeably. By March 3rd, Navy corpsmen were threatening to evacuate him by force if he didn't seek proper medical treatment. On March 1st, 1945, 10 days after the initial landing, Company A received orders to advance toward the northern end of Iwo Jima, where Japanese defenders had consolidated their remaining forces. Intelligence estimated 4,000 enemy soldiers remained in fortified positions in the island's northern highlands. The terrain was even worse than the southern beaches. Vertical cliffs, narrow ravines, and underground tunnel complexes that made every advance a nightmare of close-quarters combat. Stein had personally destroyed 26 Japanese positions since landing on February 19th. He had fired an estimated 11,000 rounds from the Stinger. He had evacuated 9 wounded Marines, and he had refused medical evacuation 7 times. On March 6, 1945, at 8:20 hours, Company A encountered heavy resistance from Japanese positions near a location later designated Cushman's Pocket on Marine Corps maps. Stein was advancing with a patrol when Japanese machine gun fire pinned them down in a ravine with limited cover. He attempted to suppress the enemy position using the Stinger, but the angle was wrong. The bipod couldn't stabilize on the uneven ground, and his shots were going high. He tried to advance to a better position. A Japanese Type 97 hand grenade landed next to him. He tried to throw himself clear, but his wounded feet couldn't move fast enough. The grenade detonated 4 feet from Tony Stein. Shrapnel penetrated his chest, abdomen, and neck. He died within seconds, so quickly that the Navy corpsman who reached him 30 seconds later couldn't do anything except confirm death. Corporal Tony Stein, 23 years old, toolmaker from Dayton, Ohio, builder of a machine gun from salvaged aircraft parts, barefoot runner who evacuated wounded Marines across volcanic ash, was killed in action on March 6, 1945, 15 days after landing on Iwo Jima. The battle for Iwo Jima continued for another 20 days after Stein's death. Company A fought until March 26th, when the island was declared secure. Of the 6 Stingers built by Stein and Grevich, only 1 survived the battle intact. 2 were destroyed by enemy fire. 1 jammed permanently from overheating. 1 was lost when its operator was killed. The surviving Stinger was packed with other captured equipment and shipped back to the United States, where it disappeared into a depot warehouse and was never seen again. None of the 6 original Stingers exist today. They were field modifications, non-standard equipment, the kind of weapons the military typically destroys rather than preserves. But Tony Stein's actions on February 19, 1945, were preserved in after-action reports, witness testimonies, and Medal of Honor recommendations. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson submitted Stein's Medal of Honor package in May 1945, detailing the 8 trips to the ammunition resupply point, the 20 enemy soldiers killed, the 9 wounded Marines evacuated, and the sustained combat effectiveness of a weapon built from salvaged aircraft parts in a maintenance shed in Hawaii. The recommendation was endorsed by every officer in the chain of command: regiment, division, Fleet Marine Force, Pacific Command. Everyone who reviewed the reports agreed. Corporal Tony Stein had demonstrated conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. On February 19, 1946, exactly 1 year after Stein's actions on Iwo Jima, his widow Joan received his Medal of Honor at a ceremony in the Ohio State House. Ohio Governor Frank Lauscher presented the medal while Tony's mother Rose stood nearby, tears streaming down her face. Her son, the Jewish immigrant's child who had dropped out of high school to work as a toolmaker, had received the nation's highest military honor. The Medal of Honor citation read in part, "The first man of his unit to be on station after hitting the beach in the initial assault, Corporal Stein, armed with a personally improvised aircraft-type weapon, provided rapid covering fire as the remainder of his platoon attempted to move into position. When his comrades were stalled by a concentrated machine gun and mortar barrage, he gallantly stood upright and exposed himself to the enemy's view, thereby drawing the hostile fire to his own person and enabling him to observe the location of the furiously blazing hostile guns." The citation continued for 3 more paragraphs, detailing each of his 8 trips to the beach, the wounded Marines he evacuated, and his refusal to seek medical treatment despite his wounds. It mentioned the personally improvised aircraft-type weapon, but did not use the name Stinger. That name existed only in Marine Corps oral history, passed down through generations of Marines who heard the story of the toolmaker from Ohio who built a gun from salvaged aircraft parts and killed 20 Japanese soldiers while running barefoot through volcanic ash. Tony Stein's remains were returned to Dayton in 1948. He was buried in Calvary Cemetery with full military honors, the only Medal of Honor recipient from that city in World War II. Visitors still leave coins and small American flags at his grave. In 1972, the United States Navy commissioned USS Stein, a Knox-class frigate, in his honor. The ship served for 21 years before being decommissioned in 1993. The Marine Corps preserved his story in training materials at Paris Island, where recruits learn about improvisation and adaptation in combat. The Stinger itself became a legend in military firearms history. Ian McCollum of Forgotten Weapons documented the weapon's design, and the Canadian Historical Arms Museum built a functional replica that demonstrated what Stein and Grevich had accomplished with basic tools and mechanical knowledge. Tony Stein was 23 years old when he died. He had been a Marine for 2 years and 5 months. He fought on 2 islands, killed at least 26 enemy soldiers, saved 9 lives on a single day, and did it all with a weapon he built in a maintenance shed using salvaged aircraft parts, scrap metal, and the mechanical intuition he'd learned working a lathe in Dayton, Ohio. The Barefoot Corporal represents something fundamental about the Marine Corps ethos: improvise, adapt, overcome. When standard equipment fails, build something better. When wounded, keep fighting. When faced with impossible odds, charge forward anyway.